This video unfolds the hidden grim realities of the medieval ages, focusing on the hardships men experienced, detailing the horrifying trials and tribulations they had to endure. Chapter 1. Forced into the Crusades. The Middle Ages was a time of great religious fervor and political expansion, leading to the infamous Crusades, a series of holy wars waged by Christians against Muslims to regain control of the Holy Land. Men were compelled to partake in these brutal expeditions, often driven by social pressure, religious fervor, or simply the promise of absolution for sins and eternal salvation. Many men, including knights and peasants alike, were obliged to leave their homes, bid farewell to their families, and traverse thousands of miles to unknown lands. The Crusades were not an endeavor for the faint-hearted. The journey to the Holy Land itself was laden with adversities like disease, starvation, and the constant threat of attacks. The men who were forced into the Crusades found themselves immersed in intense battles against a formidable enemy. The skirmishes were brutal and bloody, with deaths numbering in the thousands. Their dreams of glory and honor were often cut short by the harsh realities of war. The overwhelming majority were destined never to return home, their lives brutally snuffed out on distant battlefields. The life of a crusader was one of deprivation and hardship. They had to grapple with inadequate supplies, lack of nourishment, and the ever-present threat of death. Far away from the comforts of home, the men lived in dire conditions, often forced to resort to desperate measures for survival. Psychological trauma was another significant aspect of the Crusades. The men who survived the battles were often left with deep emotional and psychological scars, having witnessed and participated in acts of unimaginable violence. The image of the brave and noble crusader, so often romanticized in literature and lore, belies the horrifying experiences these men had to endure. Even after returning home, the surviving crusaders found no respite. Many were alienated from their communities, their war-tainted identities a stark contrast to the life they once knew. They struggled with the physical injuries and psychological trauma sustained during the war. The Crusades represented a dark chapter in the history of medieval men, a chapter marked by coercion, suffering, and loss. Chapter 2. Plague Victim Experience. Arguably, one of the most horrifying experiences of the medieval age was falling victim to the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, which decimated the population of Europe in the mid-14th century. Men were not spared from this deadly disease, and their experiences were nothing short of a living nightmare. The plague crept upon its victims swiftly and mercilessly. Men would first feel feverish and fatigued, followed by agonizing aches and the emergence of swollen, painful lymph nodes known as buboes. Within a span of a few days, the disease would wreak havoc on the victim's body, often resulting in a gruesome death. During the plague, society was thrown into chaos. Many men, in their roles as community leaders, physicians, and clergy, were thrust onto the front lines of the catastrophe. These roles exposed them to a higher risk of infection, leading to a high mortality rate amongst those providing care and maintaining order. Not only was the physical suffering immense, but so was the psychological terror. Men lived in constant fear, never knowing who would be the next victim. Social structures crumbled as neighbors turned against each other, families abandoned the infected, and communities collapsed under the weight of death and despair. Chapter 3. Feudal Servitude. Feudalism was the dominant social system in medieval Europe, and under it, the majority of men lived lives of serfdom. They were bound to the land owned by the lords, working tirelessly to grow crops and raise livestock, while also providing services like building roads and bridges. Their existence was dictated by the whims of their feudal lords. Men worked long, arduous hours with little to no pay, and were always at the mercy of their lords' demands. The lack of any significant rights made it impossible for them to improve their conditions. The work was physically grueling and offered little reward. Despite toiling from dawn to dusk, most of the produce was handed over to the lords as rent. What little was left was used for sustenance, leaving no room for any betterment in life. Moreover, they lived in constant fear of increased levies, punishments for minor offenses, and the ever-present threat of war. Any disagreement with the lord could result in harsh penalties, even death. The men under feudal servitude were, for all intents and purposes, prisoners in their own homes, trapped in a cycle of ceaseless labor and perpetual poverty. Chapter 4. Brutal punishments for crime. In the medieval ages, the justice system was both harsh and brutal, especially towards men. Punishments for crimes, regardless of their severity, were usually physical and public, designed not just to penalize but to humiliate the wrongdoer and deter others. Even minor infractions, such as stealing or not paying taxes, could result in harsh penalties. Men found guilty of these crimes could face punishments such as flogging, branding, or mutilation. The stocks and pillory were commonly used to publicly humiliate offenders, leaving them exposed to the elements and the ridicule of passers-by. More serious crimes, like murder or treason, were met with even more horrifying punishments. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, burning at the stake, or being crushed under heavy stones were among the brutal methods employed. These were spectacles of terror designed to serve as grim warnings to anyone who dared defy the law. These punishments were not only physically excruciating but also psychologically tormenting. The men subjected to them were stripped of their dignity, their pain amplified by the public nature of the punishment. Furthermore, the justice system was often arbitrary, making any man a potential victim of its cruelty. Chapter 5. Hardships of peasant life. Peasant life during the Middle Ages was fraught with difficulties and hardships. Men, as primary breadwinners, had the unenviable task of providing for their families under harsh conditions and with limited resources. The workdays were long, often starting at dawn and ending at dusk, with little rest in between. Men would toil in the fields, performing back-breaking labor in all weather conditions. Their diet was poor and monotonous, usually comprising bread, porridge, and ale, with meat being a rare luxury. Living conditions were squalid. Most peasant families lived in one-room houses made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. There was little to no sanitation, leading to frequent outbreaks of diseases. Access to medical care was scarce, and most illnesses were treated with rudimentary home remedies. Despite their arduous labor, peasants remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy, with no hope for upward mobility. They were heavily taxed and had to give up a significant portion of their produce to their feudal lords. Any attempt to resist or rebel could lead to severe punishment, making their life one of perpetual hardship and suffering. Chapter 6. Forced child labor. The cruel realities of the medieval ages did not spare even the most vulnerable, with children often subjected to forced labor. Boys, as soon as they were physically able, were expected to contribute to the family's survival. This premature burden of work disrupted their childhood and hindered their overall development. Young boys were often apprenticed to learn a trade. These apprenticeships, while providing a means to learn a skill, could be brutal. The boys worked long hours under harsh conditions, with little to no compensation. Punishments for mistakes were often severe and physical, leaving deep scars, both physical and psychological. Many were also forced to work in the fields alongside their parents, performing grueling labor that was beyond their physical capacity. This intense physical work often led to severe health issues and stunted growth. Furthermore, the emphasis on work left little time for education, resulting in widespread illiteracy. Chapter 7. Struggles of military training. Medieval military training was a rigorous and brutal affair, intended to forge men into hardened warriors. The process often began in boyhood, with young boys sent off to serve as pages in a knight's household. Here they learned basic military skills and etiquette, often under severe discipline and rigorous conditions. As they grew older, the training grew more intense. Boys, barely into their teens, were promoted to the rank of squire. They were expected to care for their knight's horses, maintain his armor and weapons, and even accompany him into battle. This experience was often terrifying and grueling, with young squires exposed to the brutal realities of war at an early age. When they reached their late teens or early 20s, if they survived, the squires would undergo the ceremony of knighthood. But even this elevated status did not ensure an easy life. Knights were expected to adhere to a strict code of chivalry and honor, which often led to dangerous and deadly situations. They were also expected to serve their lord in battle, exposing them to constant danger and the harsh realities of medieval warfare. Chapter 8. Torture for Confessions. In medieval times, the concept of innocent until proven guilty was largely absent. Instead, confessions were considered the most reliable form of evidence, and these were often obtained through torture. This merciless approach impacted men significantly, as they were commonly subjected to horrifying methods to extract confessions. Devices such as the rack, the wheel, or the infamous Iron Maiden were employed to inflict immense pain. The psychological terror these methods incited was as effective as the physical agony in coercing confessions. Innocent or guilty, men found themselves confessing to crimes just to make the torment stop. This inhumane practice was justified by authorities under the guise of serving justice. However, it left a dark stain on the fabric of medieval society, highlighting the ruthless extent to which the system would go to enforce its will. These torturous practices scarred countless men physically, emotionally, and psychologically, often leading to permanent disabilities or premature death. Chapter 9. The Danger of Travel. Traveling during the medieval ages was fraught with risks and danger. Lack of proper roads, threat of bandits, and the peril of diseases made travel a daring endeavor, particularly for men who, owing to their roles as traders or knights, often had to undertake long journeys. The roadways, if they could be called that, were treacherous, often little more than dirt paths littered with obstacles. Traveling by sea was not much safer, with the threat of storms, shipwrecks, or pirate attacks. Furthermore, the lack of accurate maps and navigational tools made it easy to get lost or stranded in unknown territories. Aside from the physical dangers, travelers also had to deal with the threat of bandits or highwaymen who prowled the roads. Traveling merchants were particularly at risk, often targeted for their goods and money. Even knights, despite their martial prowess, were not safe from these threats. Additionally, disease was a constant companion on the road. The close quarters and poor sanitation made travelers susceptible to various illnesses, with little access to proper medical care. The journey itself, thus, often proved to be as deadly as the wars or trade disputes the men were traveling for. Chapter 10. Ordeals of War. War was a constant in the medieval period, and men bore the brunt of these conflicts. As soldiers and knights, they were thrust onto the battlefield where they faced gruesome violence, life-threatening injuries, and the harrowing reality of death. The actual combat was brutal and chaotic. Armed with swords, axes, or spears, men fought in close quarters, often resulting in horrific injuries. There was little to no medical treatment available on the battlefield. Many wounds, which would be considered treatable today, became death sentences due to infection. Surviving the battlefield was only the beginning of their troubles. Soldiers returning from war were often left with deep psychological scars, a condition now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. However, in the medieval period, the mental health of these veterans was largely ignored. Furthermore, the constant state of war often led to devastation of the land and resources. This brought about economic hardships and famine, affecting the entire society, but particularly the soldiers and veterans who often came back to find their homes destroyed and families starved. Chapter 11. Religious Persecution. In an era where religion dictated life, religious persecution was a harsh reality. Men who strayed from the dominant Christian faith were subjected to discrimination, violence, and even death. This was particularly true for groups like the Jews, Muslims, pagans, and later, even those accused of heresy within Christianity. Those accused of heresy were subjected to inquisitions, a notoriously brutal process aimed at rooting out and punishing heretics. Men suspected of heresy were tortured until they confessed. If they were found guilty, they faced severe penalties, including excommunication, banishment, and even execution. Moreover, religious wars, like the Crusades, often led to widespread persecution of religious minorities. Men of differing faiths were slaughtered in the name of religious purity, their homes destroyed, and families torn apart. Religious persecution in the medieval ages illustrates a grim reality of the period. A lack of religious tolerance and freedom that led to the suffering and death of countless men, serving as a somber reminder of the atrocities committed in the name of faith. Chapter 12. The Knight's Code and Chivalry. Knighthood in the Middle Ages, while often romanticized, was a role fraught with peril and hardship. A significant aspect of a knight's life was adhering to the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that dictated his conduct in war and in peace. These principles, while noble in theory, often led to difficulties and dilemmas. Chivalry demanded absolute loyalty from a knight to his lord and lady. This meant that knights were often required to engage in conflict on behalf of their lords, regardless of the righteousness of the cause. This unquestioning loyalty often led knights into battles that were ethically dubious, and it placed them in morally challenging situations. Valor and bravery were virtues highly praised in a knight. However, this expectation led to a culture of reckless daring and often unnecessary violence. Knights were expected to face death without fear, a concept glamorized in the period's literature and songs. This romanticized notion of heroism belied the grim reality of war and the horrific injuries knights often sustained. Furthermore, chivalry demanded that knights show mercy towards their vanquished foes. However, this ideal often conflicted with the harsh reality of warfare. Many knights found it difficult to reconcile the noble ideals of chivalry with the brutalities they witnessed and perpetrated on the battlefield. The code also dictated the knight's behavior off the battlefield. Knights were expected to be paragons of virtue, courteous, honorable, and generous. However, maintaining these virtues in a society characterized by violence and political intrigue was challenging. Any lapse in behavior could lead to disgrace, further adding to the knight's stress and anxiety. Moreover, the social and economic burdens of knighthood were considerable. Knights were expected to maintain a certain lifestyle, including expensive armor, weapons, and horses. They were also required to host lavish feasts and participate in costly tournaments. These expectations often led to severe financial strain, as not all knights came from wealthy backgrounds. Lastly, the idea of courtly love, a cornerstone of chivalric code, presented its own set of challenges. Knights were expected to dedicate themselves to the service of a lady, often expressing this dedication through poetry, song, and feats of valor. However, this romanticized concept often conflicted with the realities of medieval marriage, where unions were more about political alliances and less about love. Thus, the chivalric code, while embodying the ideals of knighthood, often placed unrealistic expectations on the knights. The constant struggle to reconcile these ideals with the harsh realities of the medieval world added another layer of hardship to a knight's life. Chapter 13. The Threat of Viking Raids. The Viking Age, roughly spanning the late 8th to early 11th century, was a time of great fear and instability, particularly for the men living in areas susceptible to Viking raids. The Vikings, seafaring Norse warriors, were known for their sudden and ferocious attacks on villages, monasteries, and even cities. Living under the constant threat of a Viking raid was a terrifying experience. The Vikings typically struck without warning, taking advantage of their longship speed and their ability to navigate shallow waters. They would often arrive at dawn, catching settlements unprepared and unable to mount an effective defense. The brutality of these raids was horrifying. Men, women, and children were indiscriminately slaughtered, homes were burned to the ground, and valuable possessions were looted. Men, particularly those capable of fighting, were often targeted by the Vikings, either killed outright or taken as slaves. The male members of the community, expected to protect their families and homes, found themselves ill-equipped to fend off these fierce warriors. The Vikings were not only physically imposing, but also expert fighters, armed with superior weapons and tactics. These confrontations often resulted in heavy casualties and a sense of utter helplessness among the survivors. Captured men faced a grim fate. Many were sold into slavery, a practice known as thrall in the Viking society. As thralls, they were forced to work under harsh conditions, often suffering physical and mental abuse at the hands of their captors. Attempts at escape were met with severe punishment, and the chances of returning home were bleak. For those who survived a raid, the aftermath was almost as devastating as the attack itself. Homes and crops were destroyed, livestock was stolen, and families were torn apart. With their resources plundered, survivors faced the threat of starvation and disease. The trauma of the raid, coupled with the struggle to rebuild their lives, took a heavy toll on these men. Religious institutions were not spared from these attacks. Monasteries in particular were prime targets due to their wealth and relative defenselessness. Monks who led lives of peace and devotion found themselves at the mercy of these ruthless invaders. They were often forced to watch as their sacred spaces were desecrated and their brethren murdered or enslaved. Despite their reputation as mindless savages, the Vikings were strategic in their attacks. They exploited the political fragmentation and infighting among the European kingdoms, often striking where the local defenses were weakest. The lack of a coordinated response allowed them to continue their raids for nearly 3 centuries, leaving a trail of destruction and a lasting impact on the affected societies. For the men living in these times and regions, the Viking raids were a constant and terrifying reality. They lived under the shadow of this threat, their lives defined by fear, violence, and loss. The Vikings' menace profoundly influenced their sense of safety, their role as protectors, and their struggle for survival. Chapter 14. Starvation during famine. One of the greatest challenges faced by men during the medieval ages was surviving periods of famine. Famine was a recurrent phenomenon in medieval Europe, caused by a combination of factors including poor weather conditions, crop failures, livestock disease, and the disruption of agriculture due to wars. Physical weakness, dizziness, and fatigue were common, followed by more severe symptoms such as edema, in which the body swells due to fluid retention. Men would also suffer from impaired immune function, making them susceptible to diseases that they would ordinarily be able to resist. Mental faculties would also decline, leading to confusion, difficulty concentrating, and in severe cases, hallucinations. The emotional toll of watching their families suffer while being unable to provide for them added to their misery. Men, traditionally the primary providers and protectors of their families, were often consumed by feelings of guilt and helplessness. Furthermore, the extreme conditions of a famine often led to an increase in crime, with men driven to theft or even violence in their desperation to feed their families. In extreme cases, famine led to unthinkable horrors such as cannibalism. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that during severe famines, some people were driven to consume the dead, a desperate act that speaks volumes about the grim reality of starvation. Men involved in agriculture, the primary occupation for most medieval Europeans, faced additional hardships. Failed crops meant not only a lack of food, but also a loss of income. Peasant farmers were still expected to pay rent and taxes, often leading to crippling debt. Many had to sell their land or enter servitude to survive. For those in urban areas, the situation was equally dire. The price of food would skyrocket during famines, making it unaffordable for the lower classes. Furthermore, overcrowded and unsanitary conditions made cities breeding grounds for disease, especially when combined with malnutrition. Relief during famine was limited. The church often played a role in providing aid, but its resources were limited. Some lords would show leniency towards their peasant tenants, reducing rents or providing food, but these were exceptions rather than the norm. Famines, ultimately, were social disasters as much as they were natural ones. The stark divisions between the rich and poor became brutally evident during these times. While the wealthy could often avoid the worst effects of famine, the poor, particularly poor men with families to feed, bore the brunt of the suffering. Surviving a famine was a grim victory, leaving men physically weakened and psychologically scarred. The specter of hunger lingered long after the famine had passed, influencing every aspect of their lives, from the food they ate to the way they planned their futures. The fear of another famine, another period of devastating hunger, was a constant companion, a cruel reminder of their vulnerability in the face of nature's capriciousness. Chapter 15. The Stigma of Leprosy. Leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, was one of the most dreaded illnesses in the medieval ages. Those afflicted with this condition were subjected to severe physical suffering, social stigma, and isolation. First and foremost, leprosy is a debilitating disease. It attacks the nerves, skin, and mucous membranes, leading to disfiguring skin sores, muscle weakness, and nerve damage. For men suffering from leprosy, the physical torment was relentless and inescapable. There were no effective treatments, and the disease could progress for years, leading to severe disfigurement, disability, and eventually death. But the physical suffering was only part of the ordeal. In the Middle Ages, leprosy was thought to be highly contagious and incurable, sparking fear and revulsion among the populace. Men afflicted with the disease were often ostracized by their communities, adding a layer of psychological torment to their physical pain. A leprosy diagnosis was akin to a social death sentence. Those diagnosed with the disease were required to undergo a ritual known as the Mass of Separation, a mock funeral symbolizing their separation from society. After this, they were expelled from their communities and sent to live in leprosariums or leper houses, which were often located on the outskirts of towns. Living in a leprosarium was a harsh and lonely existence. While these institutions provided a degree of care and support, they were essentially places of confinement and isolation. Inhabitants were considered to be the living dead, stripped of their rights and cut off from the world of the healthy. Furthermore, the social and economic consequences of a leprosy diagnosis were severe. Men lost their livelihoods, their property often seized or abandoned. Families were torn apart, as spouses and children were often forced to distance themselves to avoid being associated with the disease. The stigma and mistreatment of men with leprosy in the Middle Ages is a stark reminder of the fear and misunderstanding that can surround disease. It illustrates the devastating impact that stigma can have on the well-being of individuals, extending their suffering beyond the physical symptoms of their condition and impacting every aspect of their lives. For the men who lived with leprosy in the Middle Ages, the disease was more than a physical affliction. It was a profound social and psychological ordeal that left them isolated and stigmatized.